long before England had a name, before it had kings or roads or the idea that any particular piece of ground was worth dying for. There was just an island, dense with forest, rimmed by cold grey water, sitting at the far western edge of a world that barely knew it existed. The story of how this island became England is not the story of a single conquest or a single people. It is something far older and stranger than that, a story measured not in centuries but in ice ages, in the slow grind of glaciers across rock, in the rise and fall of seas that swallowed entire landscapes whole. And it begins not with a king on a throne, but with a footprint on a Norfolk beach, left by something that was almost human, 900,000 years ago, in a world that looked almost nothing like the one we know. The earliest people to reach the land that would eventually become England were not our own species. They arrived on what was at the time simply the cold western fringe of a much larger continental landmass. No sea between Britain and Europe, just a continuous sweep of terrain running unbroken toward the horizon. We know they were here because of a place called Happisburgh on the eastern coast of England, where ancient flint tools have been eroding slowly out of low coastal cliffs for years. Tools shaped by hands that belonged to a species known probably as Homo antecessor, or something close to it, moving westward through a landscape of open grassland and scattered woodland, following the animals they hunted. They left no stories. They built nothing that endures in the way we usually mean. But they were here. And that is a fact that deserves a moment of genuine wonder before the story moves on. Britain's climate during this immense prehistoric stretch was not fixed. It shifted dramatically over tens of thousands of years, cycling between warmth and cold in rhythms that no single human lifetime could detect, but that shaped the fate of every species living through them. During warmer periods, hippopotamuses wallowed in the Thames, a fact so unlikely that it seems invented but is confirmed in bone. During colder periods, glaciers covered the island entirely, scraping the land bare and driving every living thing southward towards survival. By around 500,000 years ago, a species known as Homo heidelbergensis was living in Britain, larger and more powerfully built than modern humans, capable of coordinating complex hunts, leaving behind the butchered bones of rhinoceroses at a site in West Sussex called Boxgrove. After them came Neanderthals, moving in during the warmer intervals between ice ages and retreating again with each returning freeze. Then, around 40,000 years ago, our own species arrived, Homo sapiens. Modern humans in every meaningful sense, people who made art, carved bone, buried their dead with apparent care, and navigated a genuinely difficult world with considerable intelligence and skill. They were, in all the ways that matter, us. And they arrived into a Britain that still had one significant geographical feature it would not keep much longer: a land bridge. The vast, low-lying territory that geographers would eventually name Doggerland stretched across what is now the North Sea, connecting Britain to the European mainland in a broad, marshy, river-threaded plain, rich in wildlife, and used by both animals and people as a natural highway between worlds. Standing in the middle of it, you would have seen no ocean, no horizon of grey water, just flat, fertile ground stretching in every direction, alive with deer and wildfowl and the slow movement of human communities following the seasons. Doggerland was home. It was familiar, and then it was gone. As the last ice age drew to its close and global temperatures climbed steadily across thousands of years, the glaciers that had locked up so much of the world's water began to melt. Sea levels rose, not overnight, not dramatically, but slowly and without pause, creeping inland across Doggerland's flat terrain in a process that unfolded over generations too gradual for any individual to witness as a single event. Around 8,000 years ago, the waters closed permanently over what had been home. Britain became an island. The people already living there did not drown and did not flee. They simply found themselves, across the span of lifetimes, separated from the world they had originally come from. The North Sea now sat over what had been dry land. The Britain that settled into its new island shape was warmer, wetter, and more heavily forested than before. And its inhabitants were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, mobile, seasonally intelligent, deeply attuned to the rhythms of their environment in the way that only people whose survival depends entirely on reading the land ever become. They fished the rivers and hunted deer through dense woodland and gathered whatever the seasons offered. Their settlements were temporary because permanence was not yet the point. The food moved, and so they moved with it. Century after century, across a landscape that felt vast and sufficient and endlessly renewable. What is easy to underestimate about these people is the sophistication they carried inside them. They had no monuments, no writing, no cities, none of the things that later history tends to equate with complexity, but they possessed a knowledge of their world so detailed, so accumulated across generations of careful observation, that it represents a kind of intelligence modern life has almost entirely lost. They knew which rivers ran with salmon in which months. They knew which woodland edges sheltered deer in winter. They understood the island they lived on at a granularity that no map could capture, because the knowledge lived in them rather than on any surface outside themselves. This is the foundation on which everything else was eventually built. Not the Romans, not the Anglo-Saxons, not the Normans, but these quiet, rootless, extraordinarily capable people moving through forests that no longer exist, along rivers that have since shifted their courses, across a Britain so different from the one we recognise that it might as well be a different planet. The island they inhabited was ancient long before anyone thought to call it England, and whatever came next. The farmers, the monument builders, the warriors, the kings, they were all building on ground that had already been walked for 900,000 years. That is the weight of time that sits underneath the rest of this story, and it is worth carrying that weight forward as we go. The hunter-gatherers who had lived on the island for thousands of years were not displaced overnight. Their way of life did not simply collapse under the weight of something newer and better. What happened was slower and more complicated than that. A gradual transformation driven by the arrival, around 4000 BC, of people crossing the water from the continent in small boats, bringing with them something that would change the relationship between human beings and the land beneath their feet more completely than almost anything that came before or after. They brought farming, they brought domesticated cattle and sheep, seed grain, and the radical idea that instead of following food through a landscape, you could compel the landscape to produce food where you stood. These Neolithic newcomers did not simply add a new technique to an existing way of life. They introduced an entirely different philosophy of existence, one built on permanence, on staying put, on reshaping the world rather than moving through it. Fields were cleared from dense woodland with stone axes, a process so labour-intensive it is difficult to fully imagine without standing in front of an old-growth tree with nothing but a polished stone in your hand. Enclosures were built, animals were penned, seeds were planted and tended and harvested and stored against the winter. The seasonal mobility that had sustained human life on the island for millennia began to give way, slowly and unevenly across different communities and different landscapes, to something that looked, for the first time, like settlement, and with settlement came something else entirely, the impulse to mark the land in ways that would outlast a single human life. The Neolithic period left Britain with monuments that still stand today, scattered across the landscape from Cornwall to the far north of Scotland, and their survival across 5,000 years is itself a kind of argument about how much effort went into building them. Long burial mounds, elongated earthen structures covering stone chambers where the dead were placed, appear across the chalk downlands of southern England and the limestone hills further north. Causewayed enclosures, circular earthworks broken by multiple entrances, served as gathering places for communities spread across wide territories, sites for exchange, ceremony, and the management of the dead in ways we can partially reconstruct but never fully recover. These were not the works of primitive people scratching desperately at a hostile world. They were the products of organized communities with surplus labor, long planning horizons, and a shared cosmology sophisticated enough to require permanent physical expression. The most famous of all these monuments sits on open ground on Salisbury Plain in the south of England, and it has been puzzling people for so long that the puzzlement has itself become part of its identity. Stonehenge was not built in a single moment of inspiration. Construction began around 3000 BC and continued in distinct phases across more than 1,000 years, with each generation inheriting what the previous one had left and adding to it according to their own understanding of what the site required. The earliest version was modest, a circular ditch and bank with a ring of pits, significant in its layout but unremarkable in its physical presence. What came later was anything but modest. The bluestones, each weighing up to 4 tons, were transported from the Preseli Hills in Wales, roughly 200 miles away, by communities with no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, and no written engineering plans. How they did it remains productively unresolved. Theories involving sledges, rollers, rafts, and human muscle have all been proposed, tested, partially validated, and partially abandoned over the decades. With each new model arriving with considerable confidence and departing, once someone ran the numbers against the actual geography between Wales and Wiltshire, the larger sarsen stones came from Marlborough Downs, some 25 miles distant, and weigh as much as 25 tons apiece. They were shaped with extraordinary precision using stone hammers and then raised and capped with lintels in a display of communal engineering that speaks to a level of social organisation. The ability to feed, house, and direct large numbers of workers across extended periods that most people instinctively associate with much later civilizations. What Stonehenge was actually for is perhaps less mysterious than the engineering that built it suggests. It was a ritual site oriented with deliberate precision toward the movements of the sun, the midsummer sunrise aligning along the central avenue, the midwinter sunset framed by the great trilithons. For farming communities whose survival depended on understanding the seasons with accuracy, this was not abstract astronomy. It was practical knowledge given monumental form. A calendar built in stone that could be read by anyone who stood at the right point and looked toward the right horizon. Human remains have been found at Stonehenge across a span of centuries. It was a place of burial and commemoration as well as ceremony, a site where the living came to engage with something larger than themselves, and where the dead were placed in the care of whatever forces organised the turning year. By around 2500 BC, new arrivals added another layer to Britain's already complex story. The Bell-Beaker people, named for the distinctive inverted bell shape of their pottery, crossed into Britain from the continent, bringing with them the knowledge of bronze. And the island's geography suddenly became economically important in a new way. Cornwall held rich deposits of tin. Wales held copper. Combined, these two metals produced bronze, the alloy that was reshaping tools and weapons across Europe, and Britain's position as a source of essential raw materials drew it into trade networks that stretched southward to the Mediterranean world. Objects and ideas moved along these routes in both directions. The island that had spent millennia at the far cold edge of the known world was becoming, in its quiet way, connected to something larger. The transformation set in motion by the first farmers, the clearing of forests, the building of monuments, the organisation of communities around fixed places and shared ceremonies, had remade the island so thoroughly across 2 millennia that the mobile hunter-gatherer world it replaced had become almost unimaginable to the people living inside the new one. Britain was no longer simply a place people passed through. It was a place people had claimed, shaped, and marked as their own, in stone that still stands today as evidence of the ambition and the strangeness of what they were trying to do. Something shifted in Britain around 800 BC. and it arrived not as a single dramatic event, but as a gradual deepening of connections with the continental world that had been building for centuries. The knowledge of iron, harder than bronze, more widely available in its raw form, and capable of holding a sharper edge for longer, spread westward across Europe through trade, migration, and the slow diffusion of technique that moves between cultures in contact. Britain absorbed it, and the consequences reached into every dimension of life on the island. Iron tools cleared fields faster. Iron weapons changed the calculus of warfare. Iron ploughshares bit deeper into heavier soils that bronze had barely scratched, opening new agricultural land across the clay lowlands that had previously resisted cultivation. The island's population grew, the pressure on resources grew with it, and the political landscape responded to that pressure by becoming, across several centuries, considerably more organized, considerably more hierarchical, and considerably more fortified. The people who built this world are known collectively as the Celts. Though the name requires some careful handling, they were not a single unified nation arriving in Britain on a particular date with a shared political program. They were a broad family of cultures and languages that spread across much of Europe from around 800 BC onward, linked by common artistic traditions, shared religious practices, and related tongues that linguists grouped together under the Celtic branch of the Indo-European family. Their presence in Britain grew through centuries of movement, trade, and cultural influence rather than through any single organized migration. And by around 500 BC, Iron Age Celtic culture was the dominant framework of life across the island. The most visible physical expression of this world was the hill fort, a large, heavily defended settlement built on high ground, surrounded by multiple rings of earthwork ramparts and ditches that required enormous collective labour to construct and maintain. Hill forts appeared across Britain in their hundreds during this period, ranging from modest enclosures housing a single community to massive complexes like Maiden Castle in Dorset, whose concentric defensive earthworks still impress at a scale that makes it difficult to believe they were built without machinery. These were not simply refuges of last resort. They were the political and economic centres of the tribal kingdoms that organised Celtic Britain, places where leaders held court, where surplus grain was stored, where craftspeople worked, and where the social bonds of the community were regularly renewed through gathering and ceremony. The tribal kingdoms that controlled these hilltop centres competed with one another for territory, for cattle, and for prestige in ways that produced both persistent low-level conflict and elaborate diplomatic relationships. Leaders demonstrated their authority partly through military success and partly through generosity, the ability to feast followers, distribute gifts of fine metalwork, and maintain the loyalty of the warrior class that gave a kingdom its military weight. And the metalwork these communities produced was, by any standard, extraordinary. Celtic craftspeople working in iron, bronze, gold, and silver created objects of breathtaking technical and aesthetic sophistication. Talks of twisted gold worn around the neck as symbols of status. Shields decorated with swirling geometric designs of stunning precision. Swords with hilts inlaid in coral and enamel. The Battersea shield, pulled from the Thames in the 19th century, and the Waterloo helmet, found in the same river, are Iron Age British objects of such refined beauty that they sit in the British Museum today alongside the treasures of Egypt and Greece without embarrassment. This was not a culture scrabbling at the margins of civilization. It was a culture at the height of its own considerable powers. What held the whole social and intellectual world of Iron Age Britain together in the absence of writing was a class of people whose importance is easy to underestimate precisely because they left no documents behind. The Druids occupied a position in Celtic society that combined the functions of priest, judge, philosopher, historian, and educator in a single role of extraordinary social authority. They presided over religious ceremonies, including sacrificial rituals that Roman writers described with varying degrees of accuracy and sensationalism. They served as arbiters in disputes between individuals and between tribes. They preserved the accumulated legal traditions, genealogies, and historical narratives of their communities across generations. And they did all of this without writing a single word down. The training required to become a druid lasted as long as 20 years, 2 decades of memorization, recitation, and gradual initiation into layers of knowledge that the druidic class had decided were too important, too sacred, and perhaps too powerful to be entrusted to any physical surface that could be captured, copied, or destroyed. There is something that stops you mid-thought when you sit with that decision long enough. A society that possessed the intellectual capacity to organize complex legal codes, astronomical knowledge, and elaborate cosmologies across centuries chose deliberately to keep all of it inside human minds, rather than on any external medium. Whether this was spiritual conviction, political calculation, or simply the weight of a tradition so old that its original reasoning had long since been absorbed into instinct. The effect was to make the Druids themselves the irreplaceable vessels of everything their culture knew. Destroy the people, and you destroyed the knowledge. It was a vulnerability that Rome would eventually understand and exploit. The Britain that Julius Caesar first glimpsed across the Channel in 55 BC was against the assumptions that Roman writers brought to describing it. Neither primitive nor isolated. It was a network of tribal kingdoms, each with its own leadership structures, its own territorial ambitions, and its own sophisticated ways of making sense of a complicated world. The land was farmed with real agricultural skill. The rivers were fished and the hilltops were fortified, and the craftspeople working in the settlements below those hilltops were producing objects that travelled as trade goods across Europe and have survived long enough to end up behind glass in the world's great museums. Somewhere on Salisbury Plain, the enormous stones of a monument already ancient stood in a field that the Iron Age communities around it regarded with whatever combination of reverence and practical familiarity one feels towards something that has simply always been. There, the Romans were on their way, and the world they were about to encounter was considerably more formidable than their own accounts of it would later suggest. Julius Caesar understood something that most military commanders of his era either did not grasp or did not care to act on, that a war well documented was almost as valuable as a war well won. When he turned his attention toward Britain in 55 BC, the island existed in the Roman imagination as a place of deliberate mystery, fog-wrapped and ocean-girdled, sitting at the very edge of the known world in a way that made simply reaching it an act of considerable political theatre. Rome had organised its understanding of geography around the Mediterranean basin. Everything beyond that familiar sea existed on a sliding scale of strangeness. And Britain, sitting out past Gaul beyond the actual ocean itself, occupied a category somewhere between the real and the mythological. It was rumoured to be rich in tin, pearls, and cattle. It was said to be inhabited by warriors who painted themselves blue and fought from chariots in the manner of people who had not received the memo that chariot warfare had been obsolete for centuries on the continent. Whether Caesar believed the specific details of any of this hardly mattered. What mattered was that crossing to Britain at all, sailing beyond the edge of the civilized world with Roman legions, would generate the kind of story that followed a man back to Rome and preceded him into every room he entered afterward. The actual conquest could come later, or not at all. The theatre was the point. His first expedition in the late summer of 55 BC arrived with 2 legions, roughly 10,000 men, on the southeastern coast of Britain, and immediately demonstrated that the theatre was going to be more complicated to stage than anticipated. The beaches ideal for landing were defended by British warriors on horseback and in those same chariots that Roman sources had mentioned. And the deeper Roman warships could not get close enough to shore to unload soldiers without exposing them to attack while they were still chest-deep in the surf. The moment that salvaged the situation, and that Caesar recorded with the care of a man who knew it would be repeated, came from the standard-bearer of the 10th Legion, faced with the prospect of the legion's eagle, its most sacred symbol, the physical embodiment of its honour, being lost to the sea rather than carried onto an enemy shore. The standard-bearer jumped overboard and waded toward the British warriors alone. The soldiers watching from the ships were left with a choice between drowning in the English Channel or following their standard into battle. Most of them chose battle. It was not an elegant landing, but it was a landing. Caesar's forces established a beachhead, skirmished with local tribes across the following days, accepted what he described as a nominal submission from several British leaders, and then watched a violent storm wreck a significant portion of his fleet while it sat at anchor offshore. He patched together what ships remained and returned to Gaul before winter could trap him on the wrong side of the water. In Rome, the Senate declared 20 days of public thanksgiving to honour his achievement. Back in Britain, the local population was probably trying to decide what exactly had just happened and whether it was likely to happen again. It was the following year, 54 BC. Caesar returned with a force calibrated to the lessons of the first expedition, 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry. A fleet rebuilt and redesigned with shallower drafts to allow closer landings, and a considerably clearer understanding of what British coastal defence looked like in practice. This time he pushed further inland, crossed the Thames with real military intent, and drove the most powerful British war leader of the moment, a man named Cassivellaunus, who controlled territory north of the river, back toward his stronghold. Cassivellaunus fought a skillful defensive campaign, deploying his chariots with a mobility that repeatedly frustrated Roman attempts to force a decisive engagement, harassing the Roman columns' flanks and supply lines, rather than meeting the legions in the kind of set-piece battle where Roman discipline and formation would have been overwhelming. In the end, he submitted, offered hostages, and made promises about tribute that Caesar accepted as sufficient grounds for withdrawal. The tribute was never paid. Caesar had his story and returned to it with the material he needed. Britain had been touched by Rome, technically visited, technically subdued, and Caesar's account of both expeditions, preserved in his own elegant prose in the work known as the Gallic Wars, ensured that the island entered the permanent record of Roman achievement, but it remained unconquered, and it would stay that way for nearly another century, during which time the relationship between Britain and Rome settled into something that suited both parties well enough to make war temporarily unnecessary. Trade crossed the Channel in both directions with impressive regularity. Roman goods, wine, olive oil, fine pottery, and glassware arrived in exchange for tin, wool, slaves, and the hunting dogs that British breeders produced in a quality that Roman sportsmen apparently found worth paying for. British tribal leaders began adopting Roman customs with the enthusiasm of people who have discovered that a neighbour's lifestyle carries considerable status. Latin appeared on British coins. Towns began to acquire a continental character. Some leaders sent their sons to Rome to be educated, returning them to Britain with Roman manners and Roman connections and Roman political expectations that the island's existing structures were not entirely equipped to accommodate. Then, in 43 AD, the Emperor Claudius decided the time had come to finish what Caesar had started, and his reasons had considerably less to do with Britain's resources than with his own political survival. Claudius had come to power unexpectedly following the assassination of Caligula, and the court that had spent years treating him as an embarrassing afterthought, a stammering, limping man kept away from public life, had not entirely revised its assessment simply because he now wore the purple. He needed a military victory substantial enough to silence the doubters. And Britain, still technically unresolved Roman business after nearly a century, offered an available and defensible target. He dispatched 4 legions under the general Aulus Plautius, crossed to Gaul to wait while his army did the hard work, and then arrived in Britain himself in time to oversee the ceremonial capture of Camulodunum, modern Colchester, accepting the submission of several tribal kings in a display of imperial authority carefully choreographed for an audience back in Rome. He stayed approximately 16 days. long enough for the optics and not a moment longer, and returned to celebrate a triumph that the Senate marked by awarding him the title Britannicus. For a man who had begun his reign as the court's most persistent joke, the transformation was complete. What followed the formal conquest of Britain in 43 AD was not simply occupation, it was transformation. And the scale of it becomes apparent the moment you start looking at the landscape with Roman eyes. The first and most immediate instrument of that transformation was the road. Not the tentative tracks that Iron Age communities had worn between settlements through centuries of use, but engineered thoroughfares built to military specifications, running in straight lines across the country with a confidence that said, clearly and in the language of infrastructure, that the people who built these roads intended to stay. Watling Street ran from the southeastern coast through the new settlement at Londinium and northwestward toward the legionary fortresses beyond. The Fosse Way cut diagonally across the island from the southwest to Lincolnshire, marking for a time the effective frontier of Roman control. Ermine Street pushed northward toward York. These roads were built to move soldiers quickly from one point of the province to another, but they ended up moving everything: trade, information, culture, disease, ideas, and people, in ways that their military architects had not specifically planned for but would certainly have understood. The roads created connectivity, and connectivity created the conditions for everything else that Roman Britain became. Londinium grew from a practical river crossing into the commercial heart of the province within a single generation. Its position on the Thames making it the natural hub of a trading network that reached in every direction. By the end of the 1st century AD, it was the largest city in Britain, equipped with a basilica and forum at its centre that together formed one of the largest public buildings north of the Alps, a governor's palace on the riverbank, and a port busy with ships carrying goods from across the empire. The city's population was genuinely cosmopolitan in a way that is sometimes surprising to encounter. Inscriptions found in London record people from Gaul, from the Rhineland, from the eastern Mediterranean, from North Africa, all living and trading and dying in a city that had not existed a century before. Aqua Sulis, the settlement the Romans built around the natural hot springs at what is now Bath, represents a different but equally revealing dimension of Roman ambition in Britain. The springs produced water at a constant temperature, warm enough to be remarkable in one of the wettest, most persistently grey corners of the entire empire, and the Romans enclosed them in an elaborate complex of heated pools, cold plunge baths, changing rooms, and a temple dedicated to the goddess Sulis Minerva, a deliberate fusion of the local Celtic deity Sulis with the Roman Minerva that reflected the empire's characteristic approach to religious diplomacy. The idea of constructing a large indoor swimming complex complete with underfloor heating and colonnaded walkways in a climate that seemed specifically designed to discourage outdoor bathing suggests that whoever commissioned the project had either never visited in November or had simply decided not to let meteorological reality interfere with architectural aspiration. Wealthy landowners across the province built villa estates that brought Mediterranean living standards to the British countryside. Mosaic floors depicting scenes from classical mythology laid by craftspeople who had learned their trade in workshops connected to continental traditions. Underfloor heating systems that circulated warm air beneath tiled surfaces. Formal gardens, bath suites, and dining rooms designed for the kind of elaborate hospitality that Roman social life organised itself around. Not everyone accepted the new order peacefully, and the revolt that erupted in 60 AD came closer to ending Roman Britain entirely than any official account of the period has ever been entirely comfortable admitting. The Iceni tribe of what is now Norfolk had maintained a client relationship with Rome under their king Prasutagus, a mutually convenient arrangement that allowed the tribe considerable internal autonomy in exchange for cooperation with Roman authority. When Prasutagus died, he left his kingdom jointly to Rome and to his 2 daughters, apparently believing this division would protect his family's position. Rome chose a different interpretation. Roman officials annexed the Iceni territory outright as a straightforward inheritance. flogged his widow Boudicca when she objected, and assaulted her daughters in acts of deliberate humiliation calculated to demonstrate the absolute nature of Roman power over client arrangements. The response that Boudicca organised was catastrophic in its efficiency. She assembled a coalition of tribes across the region, drawing in the Trinovantes of Essex alongside the Iceni, and swept south and west with a force that Roman sources estimated at well over 100,000 people, a figure almost certainly inflated but indicative of the genuine scale of the uprising. Camulodunum fell first. Its newly built Roman temple, a symbol of imperial cult worship that the local population had been compelled to fund and maintain, burning to the ground with a thoroughness that archaeology has confirmed in a layer of scorched debris still visible in excavations beneath the modern city. Then Londinium, which the governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus caught campaigning against the Druid stronghold on the island of Anglesey in Wales, could not return in time to defend and chose instead to evacuate, making the cold calculation that the city was militarily indefensible and that his forces were needed elsewhere. Then Verulamium, modern St. Albans. Roman sources recorded the dead at 70,000, a number almost certainly rounded dramatically upward. But the destruction was real and archaeologically confirmed in every city Boudicca's forces reached. The 9th Legion marched south from its base in Lincoln to intervene and was ambushed, losing its entire infantry in an engagement that must have shaken Roman confidence in the province's long-term viability more than any official dispatch admitted. Paulinus eventually gathered his forces and chose his ground with the care of a commander who understood that he could not afford to lose. A narrow defile with forest behind him and open ground in front, where the enormous numerical advantage of Boudicca's forces could not be fully brought to bear. The same terrain-based thinking that had decided battles for centuries. The Romans held their formation as wave after wave of British warriors broke against the disciplined line, and then advanced. The battle became a rout. Boudicca took poison rather than face capture, and the particular fate that Roman triumphs reserved for defeated enemy leaders. The revolt was over. Roman Britain absorbed the shock, rebuilt what had been destroyed, and continued for another 3.5 centuries, a province that had stared into genuine collapse and found, on the other side of it, the particular resilience of a system whose foundations ran deeper than any single catastrophe could reach. Empire do not end all at once. They thin out gradually at the edges, losing definition the way a fire loses heat, not in a single moment of extinction, but through a slow process of diminishment that the people living inside it often cannot perceive clearly until it is already complete. The end of Roman Britain did not arrive on a particular afternoon with a formal announcement and a lowering of flags. It came across several difficult decades in the form of withdrawals and crises and unanswered letters, and the people living through it would not have recognized it as an ending at all. They would have called it a difficult period. They would have expected, as people in difficult periods always do, that someone in authority was going to fix it. The troubles that eventually unravelled Roman Britain had their roots in pressures building across the entire empire, long before they manifested specifically on the island. Through the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, the Roman world was under strain from multiple directions simultaneously. Germanic peoples pressing along the Rhine and Danube frontiers with increasing force and organisation. Political instability at the centre, producing a succession of emperors who held power for months before being displaced by the next military claimant. And an economic system stretched by the cost of maintaining frontier defences across an enormous perimeter. Britain, as a peripheral province sitting at the far northwestern edge of the imperial world, felt these pressures as a kind of slow hollowing out rather than as a direct assault. Troops were periodically stripped from the island and sent to fight on the continent, either to shore up a crumbling frontier or to back a general who had decided that the throne in Rome was worth reaching for. The most consequential of these withdrawals came in 383 AD, when a military commander based in Britain named Magnus Maximus gathered a substantial portion of the island's garrison and crossed to Gaul with the clear intention of seizing the Western Empire for himself. He was not the first British-based general to make this calculation, and the calculation itself was not unreasonable. Britain's legions had made emperors before. Magnus Maximus held power in the West for 5 years and came genuinely close to consolidating his position before being defeated and executed by the Emperor Theodosius. The soldiers he had taken with him across the Channel did not come back. Britain made do with what remained, stretching its reduced military capacity across the same long coastlines and northern frontier it had always needed to defend, patching the gaps as best it could with forces that were visibly insufficient for the task. Then, in 407 AD, came the blow that the province could not absorb and recover from. Another commander, calling himself Constantine III, stripped nearly all the remaining Roman military forces from Britain and crossed to the continent once again, chasing the same imperial ambition that had already consumed Magnus Maximus a generation earlier. He too failed in the end, captured and executed before his ambitions could be realized. But for Britain, the outcome of his campaign was entirely beside the point. What mattered was that the legions were gone. The professional military infrastructure that had maintained order, guarded the frontiers, built and repaired the roads, and kept the administrative machinery of the province functioning across 3.5 centuries, had walked away and was simply not coming back. 3 years later, in 410 AD, the Visigoths under their leader Alaric sacked the city of Rome itself. The first time in 800 years that a foreign enemy had entered the city, and the psychological shock that travelled across the empire was profound in a way that is difficult to fully convey to a world accustomed to the idea that great powers can fall. Sometime around the same period, the Emperor Honorius sent communications to the cities of Britain informing them, in terms that historians have been debating ever since, that they would need to see to their own defence. Whether this was a formal administrative statement or simply an honest acknowledgement that Rome had more urgent problems elsewhere is a question that has occupied scholars without resolution for centuries. Either way, in practical terms, it was the end of official Roman rule in Britain. What came next is one of the murkiest and most fascinating stretches in all of English history. Roughly 150 years that fall between the clear narrative of Roman Britain and the better documented world of Anglo-Saxon England. Years that resist easy description because the written sources are thin, contradictory, and often composed long after the events they claim to record. The historian Gildas, writing in the 6th century, is the closest thing to a contemporary witness, and his work is part sermon and part lament, more interested in cataloguing the moral failures of British rulers than in recording anything so mundane as accurate dates and sequences. What archaeology suggests, with more patience and less drama than Gildas, is that Roman withdrawal did not destroy everything overnight. Towns remained inhabited. At least for a time, local leaders of Romano-British background stepped into the administrative vacuum and attempted to maintain order using the institutions they had inherited. Latin persisted among the educated. Christianity, which had spread steadily through Britain during the 4th century, continued to expand through a network of bishops and monasteries operating largely independently of any central authority. Life went on, but in a lower register, quieter, more precarious. Stripped of the supply lines and economic networks that had sustained it, the bathhouses that had been heated and maintained by complex systems of slave labour and imported fuel began to cool and fill with rubble. The Forum at Londinium, once the administrative heart of the province, fell silent. The population of the city shrank dramatically as the trade networks that had fed it contracted. The roads remained. They were built to last. And they did. But the organisation that had maintained them eroded, and grass began to claim the edges of surfaces that no one was repairing anymore. From the west came a letter, written in desperation by the remnant British leadership and addressed to the Roman general Aetius, who was at that moment occupied with the rather more pressing matter of Attila the Hun advancing across Gaul. The letter has survived in later quotation and is known as the Groans of the Britons. It described an island caught between two enemies, the sea on one side, raiders on the other, and it asked Rome plainly, and without apparent hope for help. Aetius did not reply. No help came. The western edge of empire had been left to find its own way forward, into a future that no one on the island, in those years of silence and slow dissolution, could yet see clearly enough to name. The pressures that descended on post-Roman Britain did not arrive from a single direction or according to any coordinated plan. They came from the north, the west, and the east simultaneously, each distinct in character, each adding its own layer of difficulty to a society already struggling to hold together without the administrative framework that had organised it for 3.5 centuries. From the north, the Pictish peoples of Scotland, never conquered, never fully contained even at the height of Roman power, launched increasingly bold raids southward across the old frontier that Hadrian's Wall had once defined. From the west, Irish raiders struck the coasts of Wales and the Western Peninsula in numbers significant enough not merely to plunder and withdraw, but to establish permanent settlements in some areas, leaving behind communities that would eventually shape the cultural landscape of Wales in ways still traceable today. And from the east, across the grey waters of the North Sea, came the arrivals that would ultimately remake the island most completely, the peoples known collectively as the Anglo-Saxons. The Romans had seen them coming long before the legions left. The chain of coastal forts that the late Roman administration had built along the eastern and southeastern shores of Britain, a defensive system known as the Saxon Shore, was a direct response to raids by Germanic seafarers that had been intensifying since at least the late 3rd century. Angles from what is now southern Denmark, Saxons from the northwestern coastlands of Germany, Jutes from the Jutland Peninsula. These were peoples already in regular maritime contact with Britain through trade as well as raiding, familiar with its coastlines and at least broadly aware of what lay behind them. With the forts unmanned and the legions gone, the raids intensified with a logic that required no central planning, simply the reliable discovery that defenceless wealth was available on the other side of a short sea. It is in this context that the figure of Vortigern enters the story, preserved in later sources with the ambiguous status of a man remembered for making the worst decision in British history, though in the circumstances he faced, the decision was not obviously worse than the available alternatives, facing the Pictish threat from the north and lacking sufficient military force of his own to counter it effectively. Vortigern, whose name or title meant something close to High King in the British tongue, made the calculation that Germanic warriors already skilled in exactly the kind of fighting needed could be employed as mercenaries, settled in the east of the island in exchange for military service against the northern raiders. The traditional date attached to this arrangement is 449 AD. The mercenary leaders brought over in this arrangement are named in later sources as Hengist and Horsa, brothers, supposedly, though their names translate from Old English as stallion and horse respectively, which raises the entirely reasonable suspicion that posterity may have applied some creative editing to the original personnel records. What is not in doubt is that the arrangement worked, after a fashion, for long enough to make its eventual failure more catastrophic than an immediate disaster might have been. The mercenaries fought the Picts as contracted. Then they looked more carefully at the land that had been granted to them, compared it with what they had left behind on the continent, and sent word back across the North Sea that Britain was worth taking properly. The reinforcements that crossed the water in the following years and decades came not as hired soldiers fulfilling a contract, but as settlers bringing families and communities and the clear intention to stay, and to keep coming until there was enough land for everyone who wanted some. What followed across the next several decades was a process of displacement that pushed the Romano-British population steadily westward and northward, toward Wales, Cornwall, and the old kingdoms of the north, in a movement that was neither swift nor clean, but that was ultimately decisive in reshaping who lived where on the island. The eastern lowlands fell under Anglo-Saxon control piece by piece, not through a single great conquest, but through the accumulation of individual confrontations. local agreements, and the simple demographic pressure of continuous immigration from the continent. Towns that had functioned for 3 Roman centuries were abandoned or repurposed beyond recognition. The mosaic floors that had once decorated villa dining rooms cracked under the feet of people who had no tradition of tiled floors and no particular reason to maintain them. The bathhouses filled with rubble and collapsed into themselves. The Forum at Londinium, which had once been the beating administrative heart of the province, fell into a silence from which the city would not recover its former scale for centuries. The Romano-British population did not simply vanish, and this is a point that the genetic evidence now makes emphatically clear. The descendants of pre-Roman and Roman-era inhabitants survived in significant numbers, particularly in the western and northern regions where Anglo-Saxon settlement penetrated less deeply. What was being overwritten was not the population itself, but the culture, the language, the social structures, the religious practices, the ways of organising land and labour and loyalty that had given Roman Britain its particular character. A new language spread through the eastern lowlands, the Germanic tongue that would eventually become Old English, carrying with it new names for rivers and settlements and landscape features that gradually displaced the older British ones. New gods arrived with the settlers: Woden, Thunor, Tief, the divine figures whose names survive embedded in the days of the week in a form of linguistic archaeology available to anyone who glances at a calendar. From the Western kingdoms where British rulers held on, maintaining Christian institutions and Latin titles, and occasionally organising military resistance to the eastward Anglo-Saxon advance, stories would eventually emerge about a great war leader who had managed, for a time, to halt the tide. Later centuries would call him Arthur, and they would accumulate around whatever kernel of historical reality he represented, a weight of legend so dense that the man beneath it, if there was a man, became effectively unreachable. Gildas mentions a British victory at a place called Mount Badon around the year 500 AD, a battle significant enough to slow the Anglo-Saxon advance for a generation. He does not mention Arthur by name. The silence tells its own story, or perhaps declines to tell the story, which amounts to the same thing. The island was being divided, slowly and violently, into 2 worlds that would take centuries more to find a way of becoming one again. By the time the dust of the migration period had settled into something approaching stability, the eastern and central lowlands of Britain were divided among a collection of Germanic kingdoms whose political map shifted constantly enough to make any fixed description of it immediately obsolete. Later historians would organise these into a tidy arrangement of 7, calling it the Heptarchy: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia on the eastern bulge of the island, Essex and Kent in the southeast, Sussex along the southern coast, and Wessex spreading across the southwest. The reality was considerably messier than that neat arrangement suggests. Kingdoms expanded and contracted, absorbed smaller neighbours, split apart after a king's death, and occasionally ceased to exist entirely for a generation before reasserting themselves under a new dynasty. The map of Anglo-Saxon England was never still. What held this world together was not political unity, there was none to speak of, but a shared set of cultural assumptions, a common language in its various regional forms, and a social order that, while varying in its details from one kingdom to another, at the top sat the king, whose authority rested on a combination of military success, lineage traced back to legendary and sometimes divine ancestors, and the active loyalty of the men around him. Below the king were the thanes, a warrior nobility who held land in exchange for military service and whose personal relationship with their lord was the central axis of political life, a bond maintained not through legal paperwork but through the daily reality of shared danger, shared feasting, and the reciprocal obligations of protection and service. Below the thanes were the ceorls, free farmers who owned their land, paid their taxes, and served in the army when called, living lives of genuine difficulty that were nonetheless distinguished from those below them by the crucial fact of legal freedom. And below the ceorls were those who were not free at all, the thralls, people held in slavery through conquest, debt, or the misfortune of birth, performing the heaviest and most unrewarded labour on estates across the country in conditions that the Anglo-Saxon legal codes acknowledged with a matter-of-factness that reveals how completely normalised the institution was. The typical Anglo-Saxon settlement was a small village, a cluster of timber buildings set in cleared land, surrounded by a patchwork of communal fields worked in strips by the families who lived there across the rhythm of the agricultural year. The buildings themselves were sturdy and practical, rectangular timber-framed halls with thatched roofs, packed earth floors, and a central hearth whose smoke found its way out through the thatch as best it could, rather than through any dedicated chimney. There was very little separation between the spaces where people slept, ate, worked, and sheltered their animals in the hardest months of winter. The warmth of livestock and human bodies together was a practical resource in a world where the difference between a cold house and a warm one could be a matter of survival. Larger settlements had a mead hall belonging to the local lord, a grander version of the same timber structure whose social function went well beyond eating and drinking. It was courthouse, banquet room, dormitory, and theatre simultaneously, the place where a lord demonstrated his generosity by distributing gifts, where warriors renewed their bonds of loyalty through the shared rituals of the feast, where poets performed the stories that gave the community its identity, and where the entire social hierarchy was made visible and reaffirmed on a regular basis. The mead hall was the political centre of Anglo-Saxon life in a way that has no precise modern equivalent, and the literature of the period returns to it constantly as the image of everything worth defending and everything that could be lost. Into this world, in 597 AD, came a group of 40 monks from Rome, led by a man named Augustine, dispatched by Pope Gregory I with the specific commission of converting the pagan Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity. The story attached to Gregory's motivation is one of the more appealing of the period. He had apparently encountered fair-haired Anglo-Saxon slaves for sale in a Roman market, asked who they were, been told they were Angles, and replied with a wordplay that must have seemed considerably more elegant in Latin than it does in translation, that they looked not like Angles but like angels, and that their souls deserved to be brought to God. Augustine was fortunate in his choice of landing point, or rather in the choice that Gregory had made on his behalf. The King of Kent, Ethelbert, had a Frankish Christian wife named Bertha, which meant he was already familiar with the new religion and sufficiently well disposed toward its representatives to give them a hearing rather than a swift return to the sea. Ethelbert converted, was baptized, and gave Augustine land at Canterbury to establish his church. Augustine became the first Archbishop of Canterbury, a title that has existed in unbroken succession from that moment to the present day, one of the longest continuous institutional lines in all of English history, stretching across 14 centuries from a Kentish king's conversion to the present. The conversion of the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was not a swift or linear process. It moved kingdom by kingdom, king by king, with reversals and complications at every stage. Edwin of Northumbria, one of the most powerful kings of the early 7th century, was baptized in 627 AD, following a period of deliberation that the Venerable Bede preserves in an account of extraordinary vividness. One of Edwin's counsellors compared the life of man to a sparrow flying briefly through a warm and firelit mead hall, out of the dark winter, outside, and back into it, here for a moment of light and warmth and then gone, and suggested that if the new religion offered any illumination about what lay beyond that darkness, it deserved serious consideration. The image is so perfectly Anglo-Saxon in its combination of philosophical depth and practical observation about weather that it has never entirely let go of the historical imagination. A further complication arose from the fact that Christianity reached the Anglo-Saxons from two directions simultaneously: the Roman mission from the south through Canterbury, and the older Celtic Christian tradition that had survived in Ireland and Scotland through the long years of the migration period. The two streams held different practices, most visibly different methods for calculating the date of Easter, and the tension between them was resolved formally at the Synod of Whitby in 664 AD, where King Oswy of Northumbria ruled for the Roman method on the pragmatic grounds that he would rather be aligned with the Keeper of Heaven's Keys than with an Irish monastery, and that arriving at the celestial gate on the wrong date seemed an unnecessary risk. The church that emerged from these converging streams became the primary vehicle of literacy, education, and written culture in Anglo-Saxon England, and the monasteries that spread across the countryside through the 7th and 8th centuries were simultaneously places of prayer, centres of agricultural innovation, scriptoria producing manuscripts of breathtaking beauty, and the closest thing the period had to universities. The first warning came on a clear morning in the summer of 793 AD, on a small tidal island off the northeastern coast of Northumbria called Lindisfarne. A monastery had stood there since 635 AD. Established by the Irish monk Aidan, who had crossed from the Scottish island of Iona at the invitation of the Northumbrian king, and chosen this particular strip of windswept ground for the combination of isolation and accessibility that suited the contemplative life. Over the following century and a half, Lindisfarne had grown into one of the most revered centres of Christian learning in the entire Anglo-Saxon world. Its monks had produced the Lindisfarne Gospels, an illuminated manuscript of such technical and aesthetic achievement that it remains, 12 centuries later, one of the supreme artistic objects of early medieval Europe. Its pages covered in interlaced patterns of extraordinary intricacy and portraits of the evangelists rendered with a sophistication that still stops people cold in the British Library where it now rests. The monastery held silver and gold liturgical objects, relics of the Saint Cuthbert whose cult had made Lindisfarne a pilgrimage destination of regional significance, and the accumulated wealth of over a century of royal gifts and pious donations from Northumbrian kings and nobles who understood that association with a holy site of this calibre carried its own political dividends. It also sat directly on the coast, easily visible from the sea on a clear day, unfortified in any military sense, and populated entirely by men whose lives were organised around prayer, manuscript copying, agricultural work, and the kind of spiritual discipline that left absolutely no room for contingency planning against armed assault from the water. The longships appeared without warning on a June morning, and what the men who came off them did to Lindisfarne sent a shock through the entire Christian world that the scholar Alcuin of York, then working at the court of the Frankish Emperor Charlemagne, described in letters written within days of receiving the news, with a horror that still comes through clearly across 13 centuries. Some monks were killed outright, others were dragged to the ships and taken as slaves to be sold wherever the raiders next made landfall. More were thrown into the sea. The monastery was stripped of everything portable and valuable, with an efficiency that suggested the raiders had done this before. Elsewhere, in places whose names did not make it into the written record, Alcuin framed the attack as divine punishment for the sins of the English, which was the standard interpretive framework available to a 9th century churchman confronting catastrophe. But beneath the theological scaffolding, his genuine bewilderment at what had happened is palpable. Nothing like this, he wrote to the Northumbrian king, had been seen in Britain before. He was not wrong, and not only in the obvious sense. What Lindisfarne inaugurated was not merely a new form of raiding, but a new relationship between the peoples of northern Europe and the island that sat at the edge of the ocean. The instrument that made it possible was the Norse longship, and it deserves a moment of genuine appreciation separate from the violence it delivered, because as a piece of engineering it was one of the most consequential achievements of the early medieval world. Shallow enough in its draught to be rowed directly up rivers that would have grounded any conventional vessel, light enough to be lifted from the water and carried across land between navigable waterways, seaworthy enough under sail to cross the open North Atlantic in conditions that would have been fatal to almost any other contemporary vessel, and fast enough to outrun nearly everything the Anglo-Saxons could put in the water against it. The longship combined capabilities that no previous vessel design had managed simultaneously, and the combination unlocked a geography of movement that transformed what was strategically possible. Monasteries were the obvious targets in the early decades of what would come to be called the Viking Age. They were wealthy by the standards of the time, often built on coasts or riverbanks for the practical reasons of water access and communication that made those locations desirable. Entirely undefended in any meaningful military sense, and populated by communities whose entire way of life was organised around values that had no category for what was happening to them. The monks who had chosen a beautiful tidal island for its spiritual tranquility had, without any way of knowing it, also chosen an excellent location from the perspective of someone arriving by sea with no interest in their manuscripts. Through the late 8th and early 9th centuries, the raids remained seasonal, fast, targeted, concentrated on the most rewarding locations, and concluded before the autumn storms made the North Sea dangerous. Jarrow was hit the year after Lindisfarne. Iona was raided repeatedly across several decades, its community eventually relocating the most precious of its relics to Ireland. Communities along the coasts of Wales, Ireland, and the Frankish territories to the south suffered the same pattern of sudden appearance, swift violence, and departure before any organised response could be mounted. Then, in 865 AD, a force that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle described with the blunt phrase, "the great heathen army," landed on the eastern coast of England, and everything that had been true about the Norse presence in Britain till that moment ceased to be true. This force was different from everything that had preceded it in one critical and defining respect. It did not leave. It wintered in East Anglia, extracted horses and provisions from the local king, who was hoping that cooperation would purchase safety at a manageable price, and in the following year turned north and marched on York. The leaders most associated with this army were the sons of a Norse warrior of legendary reputation known as Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar, called the Boneless, along with his brothers Halfdan and Ube. Whether Ragnar himself was a genuine historical figure or a legend assembled over time from the accumulated reputations of several different men is a question Norse scholars have been circling without resolution for a considerable time, generating in the process a volume of academic literature disproportionate to what the original sources actually contain. His sons, whatever their father's historical status, were real enough in their consequences. York fell in 866 AD, and 3 of the 4 great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell in the decade that followed, dismantled by an army that had crossed the North Sea not to raid and return but to conquer and remain. The island that Augustine had helped to Christianize, that Bede had documented with such patient scholarship, that Alfred's own grandfather had ruled as king, was being taken apart piece by systematic piece, and the question of whether anything English would survive the process was, by 878 AD, genuinely open. The Somerset levels in the depths of winter are not a landscape that invites lingering. The land is flat and waterlogged, cut through with channels and reed beds that in the 9th century were far more extensive than anything visible today. A genuine maze of marsh and boggy island territory that was difficult to navigate, even for people who had spent their entire lives learning its patterns, and effectively impenetrable for any organised military force trying to move through it with equipment and numbers. It was into this landscape that Alfred, King of Wessex, retreated in the early weeks of 878 AD, after the Norse leader Guthrum launched a winter campaign of such speed and precision that it collapsed the West Saxon military structure almost before anyone had time to understand what was happening. The attack came in January, the season when campaigning was not expected, when defences were at their lowest, and when the psychological shock of finding an enemy army in your territory during the months conventionally reserved for survival rather than warfare was itself a weapon as effective as anything carried in Norse hands. Within weeks the West Saxon court was scattered, the kingdom's military organisation had dissolved, and the man who had been king of the last standing Anglo-Saxon kingdom was moving through the Somerset marshes with a handful of followers and no obvious path back to anything resembling his former position. He was 28 years old. 3 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had already fallen. The 4th was, for all practical purposes, in Norse hands. The story that attached itself to this low point in Alfred's life, preserved in a biography composed roughly a century after his death by a Welsh scholar named Asser, involves a peasant woman, a cottage fire, and a batch of burning bread cakes that has lodged itself in the English historical imagination with a tenacity that more conventionally heroic episodes rarely achieve. Alfred, sheltering anonymously in the household of a cowherd on the marshy island of Athelney, was asked by the woman of the house, who had no idea that her dishevelled, preoccupied guest was the King of England, to watch some flat cakes baking over the fire while she attended to other work. He agreed. Then he sat and thought about his kingdom, about the army he no longer had and the enemy he could not currently face. And the cakes burned to ruin on the hearth in front of him. The woman returned, assessed the situation, and delivered her verdict on his attentiveness in terms that the sources suggest were direct, unambiguous, and entirely without the deference that would normally attend a conversation between a peasant and a king. Since she was operating under the reasonable assumption that she was speaking to an ordinary man who had simply failed at a simple task, Alfred accepted the scolding without revealing who he was. The story is almost certainly embellished and may be substantially invented, but it has survived for over 1,000 years because it captures something that people found not merely plausible but characteristic about the man, that he was capable of being so completely absorbed in the larger problem that he lost track of the immediate and practical one burning directly in front of him. What is not in question is that Alfred used the months at Athelney productively, in whatever combination of genuine strategic thinking and enforced waiting the period actually contained. He maintained contact with loyal West Saxon nobles scattered across the region through a network of messengers, moving through the marsh country with the kind of local knowledge that no Norse occupying force could easily replicate. He conducted small-scale raids against Norse-controlled territory, not large enough to constitute a military campaign, but sufficient to keep his presence known, gather intelligence about the disposition of Guthrum's forces, and demonstrate to the West Saxon population that their king was still alive and still fighting, rather than dead or fled to the continent. He was building something in those months in the marshes, even if what he was building was invisible to everyone around him and possibly not entirely clear to himself. The patient accumulation of the conditions necessary for a single decisive moment that he could not yet see but was working toward nonetheless. In the spring of 878 AD, he sent out messengers calling the fighting men of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire to assemble at a place called Egbert's Stone, a landmark in the east of Somerset whose precise location has been disputed by local historians with a thoroughness that suggests the dispute may never be fully resolved. What is not disputed is what happened when the summons went out. They came. The force that assembled at Egbert's Stone was not enormous by the standards of what it was about to face, but it was real. It was motivated, and it had spent the winter under Norse occupation developing the particular kind of determination that tends to produce soldiers willing to stand in a shield wall when the alternative is watching everything they know disappear permanently. Alfred led this force eastward across Wiltshire and caught Guthrum's army at a place called Eddington, Eathandun in Old English, in a battle whose brevity in the sources is entirely at odds with its historical significance. Alfred's forces are attacked in close formation, drove the Norse army back to its fortified camp, besieged the camp for a fortnight, and forced a surrender that Guthrum had no realistic choice but to accept. The terms Alfred set in the aftermath of Eddington were more remarkable than the victory itself, and they reveal something about Alfred's understanding of what winning actually required that goes well beyond tactical military thinking. He did not demand Guthrum's death. He did not insist on the immediate withdrawal of all Norse forces from England. He demanded, as the central condition of peace, that Guthrum accept Christian baptism, a requirement whose significance in the political language of the 9th century was both religious and deeply practical. The ceremony took place at a place called Aller in Somerset, with Alfred standing as Guthrum's godfather in a gesture of deliberate symbolic weight that recast the relationship between the two men as one of spiritual kinship rather than pure military domination. Guthrum received the baptismal name Athelstan, stayed at Alfred's court for 12 days of celebration afterward as an honoured guest rather than a defeated enemy, and then departed to honour the agreement that would divide England between them. The Treaty of Wedmore acknowledged what was already geographically true, that Norse settlement in the north and east was too deeply established to be uprooted by the forces currently available, while securing Wessex and the southwest as definitively English territory. It was not unification, it was the creation of the conditions from which unification might eventually become possible, which was a different and more realistic ambition, and exactly the kind of thinking that would come to define everything Alfred did next. The peace that Alfred won at Edington and formalised through Guthrum's baptism was not a conclusion. It was an interval, and Alfred understood it as such with a clarity that separates him from most rulers of his era. The Norse forces that had dismantled 3 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in a decade had not been destroyed at Edington. They had been defeated in the field and pushed back to the territory they already controlled. Guthrum would honour the treaty in his fashion, but Guthrum was one leader among many, and the North Sea that had delivered the great heathen army would continue to deliver successors as long as Britain remained a place where crossing that water offered better prospects than staying on the other side of it. The only answer to that logic was to make Wessex so difficult to raid, so quickly responsive to military threat, and so structurally resilient that the calculation changed for anyone contemplating another attempt. Alfred spent the years following Edington doing exactly that, working across multiple dimensions simultaneously with the systematic energy of a man who had spent months in a marsh thinking about what needed to be done and was now, finally, in a position to do it. The burr system was the most immediately practical of his reforms, and its design reveals an administrative mind of considerable sophistication working behind the military commander. Across Wessex, Alfred ordered the construction of a network of fortified towns, burhs, positioned at intervals calculated so that no point in the kingdom lay more than about 20 miles from one of them, a distance that a person could travel in a single day, and that meant any Norse raiding force operating in Wessex would always be within striking distance of a defended position capable of organising a response. Each burh was surrounded by earthwork defences and maintained by the local population according to a formula tied precisely to the amount of land they held. The larger the land holding, the greater the obligation to provide men for the garrison and labour for the upkeep of the walls. This formula was written down in a document known as the Burgel Hidage, which survives and allows historians to see with unusual precision exactly how the system was organised and resourced. A level of administrative transparency that is itself revealing about the kind of governance Alfred was trying to build. What makes the burh system remarkable beyond its immediate military function is what it became over time. Many of these fortified positions were not simply defensive installations but planned towns, laid out with streets on a grid pattern and equipped with markets, churches, and the infrastructure of commercial life. Several of them, Winchester, Oxford, Wareham, Chichester, became the foundations of towns that still exist in substantially the same locations today, their street patterns in some cases still reflecting the original Anglo-Saxon grid beneath centuries of subsequent development. Alfred was not simply building forts against the next Norse assault. He was, in the most concrete and literal sense, building England, creating the urban framework of a kingdom that would outlast both the threat he was responding to and the dynasty he represented. His reorganisation of the Fyrd, the Anglo-Saxon citizen military force, addressed a structural problem that had contributed directly to the collapse of 878 AD. The old system required all eligible men to serve simultaneously when the king called them, which worked adequately for a short campaign, but became catastrophic when extended warfare stripped the farms of the labour needed to plant, tend, and harvest the crops that fed everyone, including the army itself. Alfred divided the obligation, requiring roughly half the available fighting men to be on active service at any given time, while the other half remained at home to work the land. Then rotating the two groups so that military capacity was maintained continuously, without destroying the agricultural economy it depended on. It was unglamorous administrative work of the kind that rarely generates legends or poems, but it meant that Wessex could sustain a military presence in the field across seasons and years without collapsing the system that kept it alive, which was precisely the kind of sustained capacity that the Norse model of rapid concentrated assault was designed to encounter and overwhelm. The navy Alfred developed was newer still, and reveals a characteristic willingness to think beyond existing precedent. He ordered the construction of longships larger than the Norse vessels, built to specifications he apparently contributed to personally, and the sources note with a certain diplomatic care that the first fleet required some modification after the initial designs proved awkward to handle in practice, which is the kind of outcome that tends to result when a scholar king with no shipbuilding background draws up his own vessel plans. The point was not technical perfection. The point was that Wessex now had warships at all, that Norse fleets would no longer arrive at the English coast entirely unopposed, and that the psychological and strategic advantage of complete maritime dominance that the Norse had enjoyed for nearly a century was beginning to erode. What makes Alfred genuinely unusual among rulers of his era, and what has sustained his historical reputation across 11 centuries, is that his ambitions were not confined to the military and administrative. He had a scholarly streak of real depth, and he pursued it with the same systematic determination he brought to everything else. He taught himself to read Latin as an adult, a significant undertaking for a man already occupied with running a kingdom under continuous external threat, and organised around himself a circle of scholars drawn from Wales, Mercia, and the Frankish continent who worked alongside him on a programme of translation that was explicitly designed to make the most important texts of the Christian intellectual tradition available in Old English to people who could not read Latin. His translations included Bede's Ecclesiastical History, Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, and Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, texts chosen with evident care for their practical relevance to the project of governing well and thinking clearly about power and its proper use. The prefaces Alfred wrote to introduce these translations are among the earliest examples of English prose with a distinctive authorial voice, and they are fluent, direct, and intelligent in ways that still come through clearly when you read them. He also initiated the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a systematic record of English history maintained simultaneously at several monasteries and updated continuously across the reigns of his successors, a project of historical self-documentation without precedent in Anglo-Saxon England, and without which reconstructing the period would be immeasurably more difficult. Alfred died in 899 AD, having done something that is genuinely difficult to do. He had held a civilization together at the precise moment when its disappearance seemed most probable, and left behind enough of a structure that the people who came after him had something real to build on. Alfred left behind a kingdom that was intact and a blueprint for making it larger. But the work of actually expanding that blueprint into something resembling a unified England fell to the generation that came after him. And that generation proved, against the considerable odds of medieval dynastic politics, to be remarkably equal to the task. His son Edward, who came to the throne in 899 AD and is known to history as Edward the Elder, spent the following 2.5 decades doing something that Alfred had approached but never quite managed, taking the fight northward and eastward into the Danelaw rather than simply holding the line against it. The campaign Edward pursued was methodical rather than dramatic, a slow and deliberate process of advancing the West Saxon frontier through the construction of new burhs in reconquered territory, the careful consolidation of gains before attempting further advances, and the diplomatic management of the various Anglo-Danish lords who controlled the Midlands and the North in arrangements of varying loyalty and stability. It was not the stuff of stirring legend. There were no single battles of the Eddington variety around which a narrative could be organised and polished into poetry. It was the grinding, patient, logistically demanding work of territorial expansion conducted against opponents who were capable of fighting back effectively and who had generations of settlement behind them, which made dislodging them a more complex proposition than simply defeating them in the field. What made Edward's campaign work more completely than he could have managed alone was the partnership he maintained throughout with his sister. And it is here that one of the most remarkable figures of the entire Anglo-Saxon period enters the story. Aethelflaed was Alfred's eldest daughter, and she had married Ethelred, the Lord of the Mercians, the man to whom her father had entrusted the governance of London after its capture in 886 AD. Mercia occupied the Midlands between Wessex to the south and the Danelaw territories to the north and east, and its lord held a position of strategic significance that made the relationship between Mercia and Wessex the central axis of any serious attempt to push back against Norse control of the island. When Ethelred died in 911 AD after years of declining health, during which Aethelflaed had increasingly taken on the practical responsibilities of governance, she did not retire from public life or accept a subordinate position in someone else's political arrangements. She ruled Mercia herself, bearing the title Lady of the Mercians, and she did so not as a regent warming a seat for a future male ruler, but as a genuine political and military authority in her own right. She ordered the construction of new burhs across Mercia in the pattern her father had established in Wessex, extending the defensive network that had proved its value against Norse raiding into territory that had previously been more exposed. She coordinated military operations with her brother Edward in a working partnership that effectively doubled the strategic capacity of the English advance, each moving against different sections of the Danelaw frontier in a combination that prevented Norse forces from concentrating against either one of them effectively. She built alliances with the Welsh kingdoms to the west and maintained relationships with the various political actors across the north, with the diplomatic sophistication of someone who understood that military force alone could not hold what military force had taken. The campaigns she personally led demonstrate a grasp of both tactical and strategic thinking that the sources record with a matter-of-factness that only partially conceals how genuinely extraordinary her position was. She captured Derby in 917 AD, one of the 5 boroughs that formed the administrative centres of Danish Mercia, in fighting that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes cost the lives of 4 of her thanes who were killed within the gates, a detail specific enough to suggest the Chronicle's authors were drawing on genuine contemporary accounts rather than later reconstruction. Leicester submitted to her the following year without the need for a direct military assault, its Danish leadership apparently calculating that resistance was no longer a viable option given the momentum of the English advance. She was preparing an expedition into Northumbria when she died at Tamworth in June of 918 AD. Having held Mercia and driven the reconquest of the Midlands with an energy and effectiveness that her contemporaries recognised, and that subsequent centuries, with their tendency to organise history around male rulers, have not always adequately acknowledged. By the time Edward himself died in 924 AD, the Danelaw had been substantially reconquered south of the Humber. The Norse lords of East Anglia and the Midlands had submitted or been displaced. Norse York in the north remained outside English control, a powerful and prosperous trading city under Scandinavian authority. But the balance of the island had shifted decisively and permanently toward the English kingdoms that Alfred's reforms had made capable of sustaining a generation-long campaign. The son who inherited Edward's expanded kingdom came to it with advantages that no previous English ruler had possessed, and he used them with a confidence that reflected the genuinely transformed position Wessex now occupied on the island. Aethelstan was, by almost any measure, the most formidable English king between Alfred and the Conquest. He absorbed Norse Northumbria, bringing York under English authority for the first time since its capture in 866 AD, and received the submission of the Welsh kings, the Scottish king Constantine, and the ruler of Strathclyde at a meeting at Hereford in 927 AD. The ceremony at which these submissions were made established a ceremonial overlordship over the whole island that went well beyond anything his predecessors had claimed, and that constituted, as close as any single moment can be identified as such, the first recognisable expression of England as a political entity, rather than simply the territory controlled by the most successful of several competing kingdoms. The defining military moment of his reign came at an unidentified location called Brunanburh in 937 AD, where a coalition of Scots, Dublin Norse, and Strathclyde Britons mounted a serious combined attempt to break English dominance of the island. Athelstan and his brother Edmund met them and won a victory so complete that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, normally spare and factual in its recording of events, abandoned its usual prose entirely and broke into verse. One of the most vivid surviving examples of Old English poetry, describing ravens and carnage and the flight of the survivors with the particular satisfaction of people recording a day that had gone exactly as they had needed it to go. England existed now. It had a name, a king, and a battle poem to mark the moment. What came next would test whether it could hold together as completely as it had been assembled. The stability that Athelstan had built, and that his immediate successors had broadly maintained, was never as deeply rooted as the political achievements of the 10th century made it appear. It rested on military dominance, on the personal capabilities of individual kings, and on the continued weakness or disorganization of the external forces that might otherwise have challenged it. When those conditions changed, the fragility beneath the surface became rapidly apparent, and the change came in stages across the final decades of the century in ways that the English political class, comfortable in the prosperity of Edgar's peaceful reign, was not well positioned to recognise or respond to until it was already very nearly too late. Edgar died in 975 AD at the age of 31, leaving behind two sons by different mothers whose rival claims to the throne immediately activated the factional tensions that a strong king could suppress, but that no institutional arrangement had yet been designed to resolve. Automatically, the elder son, Edward, was crowned, reigned for 3 years, and was murdered in 978 AD at Corfe Castle in circumstances that pointed unmistakably toward the household of his younger half-brother Ethelred, whose supporters had reasons of their own for preferring a different king. How much the boy Ethelred himself knew or participated in what happened at Corfe is impossible to establish from the surviving sources, and the question has exercised historians without resolution for centuries. What is certain is that he came to the throne under a shadow that his subsequent reign did remarkably little to dispel. Ethelred was around 12 years old at his accession, which meant the early years of his reign were shaped by the advisors and nobles around him rather than by any independent royal will. And the patterns established in those early years, of factional competition, short-term thinking, and the subordination of national interest to personal advantage, proved remarkably difficult to break as he grew older and theoretically more capable of asserting his own authority. His nickname, which has followed him down 1,000 years of historical memory with a persistence that speaks to how completely it captured contemporary perception, requires a small clarification that its continued use has largely obscured. The Old English word was unrad, meaning not unprepared exactly, but poorly counselled or without good advice. And since Ethelred in Old English meant noble counsel, the nickname was a deliberate and pointed pun on his own name. Ethelred Unred, noble counsel, no counsel. It was the kind of wordplay that could only have emerged from a political culture that found his failures both genuinely damaging and faintly absurd, a combination that tends to produce the most durable mockery. The Norse raids that returned in force under Ethelred's reign were not the continuation of the Great Heathen Armies project. They were something new. Fresh fleets from Scandinavia under leaders with no connection to the earlier Danelaw settlements, drawn by the reliable intelligence that England was wealthy, that its coastal defences had relaxed during the long decades of Edgar's peace, and that the political leadership currently managing it had demonstrated a consistent preference for payment over confrontation. Ethelred's response settled into a pattern that the sources record with mounting frustration. When Norse fleets arrived on the coast, he paid them to leave. The payment was called Danegeld, and it was raised through a nationwide tax and distributed to the Norse forces in quantities that grew with each successive demand. 10,000 pounds of silver in 991 AD, 16,000 in 994, 24,000 in 1002, 36,000 in 1007, and 48,000 in 1012. The escalating figures tell their own story. The strategy had a practical flaw so obvious that contemporaries could see it clearly, even if the king appeared unable to act on the recognition. Paying raiders to leave demonstrated reliably that England was both wealthy enough to produce large sums quickly and willing enough to pay them without sustained military resistance, which was precisely the combination most likely to encourage return visits rather than permanent departure. The event that transformed a damaging but manageable pattern of tribute payments into a genuine existential crisis came in 1002 AD, when Ethelred ordered the killing of all Danes living in England on the feast day of St. Brice in November. The order was carried out with varying thoroughness in different parts of the country. The Danelaw regions, where Danish settlement was densest, largely ignored it. But in the south and west it was implemented with a violence that included, among its victims, the sister of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, who was burned alive with others who had taken refuge in a church at Oxford. Sweyn's response was not diplomatic. He brought his army to England in earnest, conducting campaigns of sustained devastation that Danegeld could no longer address because he was no longer interested in money. By 1013 AD, the English nobility had submitted to him, and Ethelred had fled to Normandy. Sweyn died in 1014 AD before he could be crowned in any formal sense, and Ethelred was invited back under conditions that included his agreement to govern more justly than he had before, a moment that some historians have identified as the first occasion on which English political actors imposed explicit conditions on a returning monarch, a small seed of constitutional thinking planted in unpromising soil. Ethelred died in 1016 AD, and the military contest between his son Edmund Ironside, who fought Sweyn's son Cnut with a personal courage and tactical skill that his father had never displayed, ended in an agreement to divide the kingdom that became irrelevant within months when Edmund died, leaving Cnut as king of all England. Canute ruled until 1035 AD, and governed with a sophistication that confounded those who had expected a Norse conqueror to behave like one. He maintained English law, worked closely with the English Church, distributed patronage with political intelligence, and presented himself consistently as a legitimate English king rather than a foreign occupier administering conquered territory. The story of Cnut commanding the tide, so frequently misread as evidence of royal delusion, was in its original context a carefully staged demonstration of royal humility, the king proving to his flatterers that earthly power had limits, that only God commanded the sea, and that a king who forgot this distinction was heading toward a very cold and instructive reminder. Edward the Confessor returned from his long exile in Normandy to claim the English throne in 1042 AD as something close to a stranger in his own kingdom. He had spent the formative decades of his life at the Norman court, spoke French more naturally than English, thought in continental categories, and brought with him a set of cultural preferences and personal loyalties that the English nobility regarded with varying degrees of tolerance and suspicion. He was deeply pious in a manner that contemporaries found genuinely impressive rather than merely performative. His commitment to prayer, to the endowment of religious institutions, and to the kind of personal sanctity that the medieval church valued would eventually result in his canonization in 1161 AD, making him the only English king to be formally declared a saint. What he was less naturally suited to was the grinding, combative, politically ruthless business of managing a kingdom whose most powerful figures were men who had thrived under Cnut, and who had no particular reason to subordinate their own ambitions to the preferences of a king they had not chosen, and did not entirely trust. The dominant political reality of Edward's reign was not the king himself, but the family that had accumulated more land, more military power, and more practical authority than any other force in the kingdom. Earl Godwin of Wessex and his sons had risen to a position of influence so extraordinary that they constituted something approaching a parallel royal dynasty, their control of territory and military resources making them capable of defying even the king when their interest required it. Godwin had, at one point early in Edward's reign, forced a direct confrontation with the king and won it, returning from a brief exile with enough military support to make resistance pointless. When Godwin died in 1053 AD, his son Harold stepped into his position as Earl of Wessex and into the same role of practical governance that his father had occupied, managing the kingdom's military affairs, leading campaigns in Wales with considerable effectiveness, and becoming, by the early 1060s, the man who actually ran England, while Edward devoted himself to his devotions and his great building project at Westminster, the abbey that Edward raised at Westminster, consecrated in late December of 1065 AD in a ceremony he was too ill to attend, brought Norman architectural ideas to English soil in a way that prefigured what was coming more completely than anyone present at the consecration could have recognised. Edward died on the 5th of January, 1066, and was buried in his new abbey the following day. Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England on the 6th of January. The speed of the coronation communicating clearly that his supporters understood the succession needed to be an accomplished fact before any of the competing claimants had time to mount a formal objection. The problem that Edward's childless reign had created, or more precisely had failed to prevent, was not simply the absence of an heir, but the existence of multiple claimants, each with sufficient grounds for their claim and sufficient military resources to pursue it. William, Duke of Normandy, maintained with considerable forcefulness that Edward had promised him the English crown during the years of his Norman exile. When Edward had few friends, and Norman hospitality had been his primary refuge, the claim was not implausible. Edward's Norman connections were deep and genuine, and his feelings toward the English magnates who had humiliated him in Godwin's confrontation were not warm. William further asserted that Harold himself had sworn a solemn oath to support the Norman succession. Taken during a visit to Normandy around 1064 AD, under circumstances that remain disputed in almost every particular, Harold had apparently been shipwrecked on the Norman coast, placed under William's authority, and participated in a military campaign alongside Norman forces before being released to return to England. At some point during this visit, an oath was sworn. Harold acknowledged that something of the kind had occurred. What he disputed was its binding character, arguing that an oath extracted under conditions of effective captivity and administered over holy relics, whose presence he had not been informed of in advance, was not the kind of commitment that a man of honour was obligated to honour, a position that the medieval church, which took oath-breaking with considerable seriousness regardless of the circumstances, was not inclined to accept. Harald Hardrada of Norway brought a third claim rooted in dynastic agreements between previous Scandinavian rulers of England, a legal basis that was tenuous by any generous reading, but that the most feared military commander in the Norse world was capable of backing with something more persuasive than legal argument. William spent the months following Harold's coronation in a feat of organisational energy that is impressive even by the standards of a man whose entire career had been defined by the ability to turn political will into military action. He recruited an army from across Normandy and from ambitious men throughout France who had been promised English land as their reward for participation, assembled a fleet of several hundred ships, secured the political endorsement of the papacy, which lent the enterprise a moral authority that Harold, as an oath-breaker, could not easily counter, and waited for weather that would allow a channel crossing. The weather did not cooperate through the summer, holding William's fleet at the Norman coast, while Harold kept his army assembled along the English Channel, watching and waiting through weeks that stretched into months as the provisions ran low and the military obligation of the Fyrd reached its natural limits. Then England was struck from the north before William could move from the south. Harold Hardrada sailed up the Humber with a fleet of approximately 300 ships, accompanied by Harold's own estranged brother Tostig, who had been exiled from England the previous year, and whose presence in the Norwegian army gave the invasion a bitter personal dimension beyond its political stakes. The northern English earls Edwin and Morcar met them at the Battle of Fulford Gate on the 20th of September and were defeated comprehensively, leaving the north of England without an effective military force and Hardrada in a position to demand its submission. Harold received the news in the south, assembled his army, and marched approximately 200 miles north in 4 days, a movement of speed remarkable enough that the Norwegian forces at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September apparently had no warning of his approach until the English army was already visible on the horizon. The battle was a complete English victory. Hardrada was killed. Tostig was killed. The survivors were allowed to sail home on 24 ships from an original fleet of 300. 2 days later, the wind in the English Channel changed direction, and William's fleet set sail. Harold turned his army around and marched south from Yorkshire within days of Stamford Bridge, pausing briefly in London to rest his forces and gather whatever reinforcements could be assembled in the time available. The stay was shorter than his commanders would have advised. The arguments for waiting, resting an army that had just completed a 200-mile march north, fought a major battle, and then marched south again, allowing the furred levies from the western and midland counties more time to arrive, giving the depleted northern forces an opportunity to regroup, were militarily sound and were almost certainly made by people around him who understood the situation clearly. Harold chose speed instead. Whether he was driven by the confidence of a man who had just destroyed one of the greatest Viking armies of the age in a single morning, by fury at reports of what William's forces were doing to the Sussex countryside while he deliberated, or by some calculation about the political cost of allowing a Norman army to ravage English territory unopposed for any longer than absolutely necessary, is a question that has occupied historians since approximately the week after the battle without producing agreement. The English army arrived in the hills north of Hastings on the evening of the 13th of October and prepared for battle the following morning on a ridge of ground that Harold had chosen for its defensive qualities. High ground, falling away steeply on the flanks, limiting the ability of William's cavalry to attack from the sides, and presenting any attacking force with the prospect of advancing uphill against a prepared defensive line. The Battle of Hastings was fought on the 14th of October, 1066, across a day of sustained and brutal attrition that lasted from mid-morning until the light began to fail in the late afternoon. Harold positioned his forces in the shield wall formation that Anglo-Saxon armies had used for centuries, a dense line of overlapping shields presenting an almost continuous barrier to frontal assault, behind which warriors with spears, axes, and swords fought in the compressed, grinding, physically exhausting manner of infantry combat at close quarters. William attacked uphill repeatedly with a combination of archers, infantry, and cavalry, and the English line held through the morning with a resilience that clearly surprised the Norman commanders. At one point a section of William's army broke and ran, briefly threatening to unravel the entire Norman assault, and a portion of the English line broke formation to pursue the fleeing soldiers, a catastrophic departure from the discipline that made the shield wall effective, which may have reflected genuine belief that the battle was won, or may simply have been the instinctive response of soldiers who saw an enemy running and could not resist the pursuit. What turned the battle in the end was the cumulative effect of hours of pressure against a defensive line that could not be reinforced, combined with the tactical use of feigned retreats to draw English soldiers repeatedly off the ridge into the open ground below where Norman cavalry could engage them on more favourable terms. Harold died at some point during the afternoon or early evening, and the precise manner of his death remains one of the more pleasantly unresolved questions in English historical debate. The Bayeux Tapestry, that extraordinary embroidered narrative of approximately 70 metres produced in the decade following the conquest, depicting the events leading to and including the battle with a vividness and detail that no written source matches, shows figures near a Latin inscription identifying Harold's death, one of them appearing to pull an arrow from the vicinity of his face and another falling under the blow of a Norman knight. Whether these figures represent the same man at sequential moments, different men, or simply the artistic conventions of a medium working at the edge of its representational capacity has been argued in academic papers, popular histories, and television documentaries without resolution. What is beyond dispute is that Harold died, that his army dissolved after his death with the speed characteristic of forces whose organisational coherence depended on a single commanding figure, and that William controlled the field by nightfall. The conquest of England was not complete. William marched toward London, devastating the countryside around it with the deliberate, systematic thoroughness of a commander who understood that demonstrating the cost of resistance was as important as defeating any particular army. He received the submission of the English nobility at Berkhamsted and was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066, in a ceremony that began with the formal ritual of coronation and was briefly interrupted when the assembled crowd cheered so loudly at the moment of acclamation that the Norman guards stationed outside the abbey, hearing the noise and apparently having failed to account for the possibility that enthusiastic sounds might emerge from a coronation, assumed a riot was in progress and began setting fire to nearby buildings. The ceremony continued inside while London burned outside, which may be the most accidentally symbolic inauguration of any reign in English history. William spent the following years suppressing rebellions with a consistency and thoroughness that left little doubt about his intentions. The harrying of the north in 1069 and 1070, following a serious uprising combined with a Danish invasion, was the most extreme expression of this policy, a systematic campaign of destruction across Yorkshire and the surrounding region that went well beyond military necessity, burning villages, slaughtering livestock, destroying stored grain and agricultural equipment across an area so thoroughly that contemporary chroniclers recorded the land as empty for years afterward, and that the archaeology of the region confirms in patterns of abandonment visible in the evidence long after the written sources have moved on. The redistribution of English land was total and swift. Within 20 years of the conquest, the great majority of English land was in Norman hands. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy replaced almost entirely by the followers William had brought with him or rewarded afterward. Norman French became the language of the court and the law. Old English retreated to the lower social registers. In 1085 AD, William commissioned the survey that would become Domesday Book, a systematic accounting of every piece of taxable land in England, who held it, what it was worth, how many people worked it, the English name for it, given not by William but by the people subject to it, noted that just as there was no appeal from the judgment of God on the last day, there was no appeal from the findings of William's surveyors. The book that resulted has been consulted by historians for 900 years and remains one of the most remarkable administrative achievements of the medieval world, a monument to the thoroughness of a conqueror who wanted to know, with precision, exactly what he had taken. The 19 years between William the Conqueror's death in 1087 AD and the accession of Henry, I produced two kings whose reigns illuminate, in different ways, the essential fragility of a system built entirely around the personal authority of a single dominant figure. William Rufus, the Conqueror's second son, was energetic, militarily capable, and so consistently hostile to the institutional church, raiding its revenues to fund his military campaigns with a brazenness that churchmen found both offensive and legally questionable, that his death by an arrow during a hunting expedition in the New Forest in 100 AD generated a notable absence of ecclesiastical mourning and a notable speed of secular action. His younger brother Henry was at the treasury within hours, moving to secure both the royal finances and the throne with a decisiveness that suggested the possibility of his brother's death had not caught him entirely unprepared. Henry I proved the ablest administrator of William's three sons. developing the machinery of royal government with a systematic attention to institutional detail that his father's more straightforwardly military genius had neither required nor particularly valued. His reign produced a more sophisticated royal administration and a document called the Charter of Liberties, in which Henry made explicit promises to his barons about the limits of acceptable royal behaviour, promises whose immediate political purpose was to secure baronial support for his accession, but whose longer-term significance lay in the principle they established, that a king could be held to specific commitments about how he would govern. The catastrophe that defined Henry's reign arrived not as a political crisis, but as a personal one. In November of 1120 AD, a ship called the White Ship left the port of Barfleur on the Normandy coast, carrying Henry's only legitimate son, William, along with approximately 300 members of the Anglo-Norman nobility, the next generation of the ruling class of England. Travelling together on a vessel whose crew had been drinking with sufficient enthusiasm to impair their navigation of a channel crossing they had made many times before, the ship struck a rock and sank. One man survived. Henry never successfully produced another male heir, and when he died in 1135 AD, the succession dispute that followed tore the country apart in ways that revealed how completely the stability of the previous decades had rested on the personal capabilities of one man rather than on any institutional foundation capable of surviving without him. The civil war between Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, and the Empress Matilda, Henry's daughter and designated heir, lasted nearly 2 decades and is known as the Anarchy, a name that captures the period's essential character accurately enough. Neither claimant could deliver a decisive military blow. The country fragmented into competing baronial lordships. Castles were built without royal permission and used as bases for local extortion. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's account of what ordinary people suffered during these years reads with an unusual rawness, describing a world in which the powerful did what they wished to the powerless with no effective authority capable of preventing them. A vision of what England looked like when the machinery of governance broke down completely that gave subsequent generations a lasting argument for why that machinery needed to be maintained and respected. The anarchy ended through exhaustion and negotiation rather than through military victory. And the young man who arrived from the continent to claim England in 1154 AD was unlike either of the previous competitors in almost every meaningful respect. Henry II was 21 years old, physically restless to a degree that reportedly exhausted everyone around him, intellectually curious in multiple directions simultaneously, administratively gifted in ways that went beyond tactical competence into genuine systemic thinking, and possessed of a temper capable of producing consequences he would spend years and considerable political capital attempting to undo. He ruled over a territory that dwarfed anything a previous English king had controlled: Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and through his marriage to the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, the enormous Duchy of Aquitaine in southern France, making him the master of more land than the French king himself, and giving England's governance a continental dimension that shaped everything about how the Plantagenet court thought and operated. Henry's great domestic project was the rationalisation of the English legal system, and the reforms he introduced across his reign constitute the foundations on which English law still stands. He extended the reach of royal courts at the expense of local baronial courts and church courts, asserting that certain categories of legal dispute, land ownership above all, belonged properly before royal judges rather than before private jurisdictions whose objectivity could not be guaranteed. He developed the use of travelling royal justices, judges who moved through circuits of the country on regular schedules, bringing standardised legal procedures to communities that had previously been subject to whatever local arrangements their most powerful neighbour could impose. He promoted the use of juries, groups of local people giving sworn testimony about the facts of disputed cases, as an alternative to trial by combat and the older ordeal-based methods, whose reliability as instruments for determining truth had always depended on a theological confidence that educated men of the 12th century were beginning to find difficult to sustain. The common law that emerged from Henry's reforms built on precedent, applied consistently by royal courts across the entire country, became the legal inheritance not just of England, but of every society that later found itself governed by institutions descended from English practice. His relationship with the Church generated the catastrophe that no amount of legal achievement has been entirely able to overshadow in the popular historical memory. Thomas Becket had been Henry's closest companion and most trusted administrator, serving as Lord Chancellor with a worldly effectiveness that sat in apparent contradiction to the spiritual authority he would later claim. When Henry appointed him Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162 AD, expecting that placing his ally in the most powerful ecclesiastical position in England would smooth his plans for bringing church courts under royal oversight. Becket's transformation was so complete and so immediate that it bewildered contemporaries and has fascinated historians ever since. He resigned the chancellorship, adopted an ascetic personal life, and became a vigorous, uncompromising defender of church independence against exactly the royal encroachments that Henry had appointed him to facilitate. The quarrel that followed moved through cycles of confrontation, partial reconciliation, exile, and renewed conflict across 8 years, generating a paper trail of theological and legal argument that illuminates the central tensions of medieval governance with unusual clarity. In December of 1170 AD, 4 knights who had heard Henry express his frustration with Becket in terms sufficiently violent to be interpreted as authorization for action, rode to Canterbury and murdered the archbishop in his own cathedral during evening prayers, an act whose shock reverberated across the entire Christian world and whose consequences for Henry's reputation and political position were severe enough to require years of careful management to contain. Becket was canonized within 3 years of his death. His shrine at Canterbury became one of the most visited pilgrimage destinations in medieval Europe, and the story of the king and the archbishop became fixed in the English historical imagination as the defining image of the conflict between royal power and institutional conscience that would recur in different forms across the following centuries. John inherited the English throne in 1199 AD as the last surviving son of Henry II. Having watched his brothers Richard and Geoffrey exhaust themselves in combinations of crusading, campaigning, and rebellion that left the Plantagenet inheritance considerably more battered than they had found it, Richard had used England primarily as a source of revenue for military adventures abroad, spending approximately 6 months of his 10-year reign on English soil and reportedly remarking with the candour of a man who felt no particular obligation to pretend otherwise, that he would have sold London itself if he could have found a buyer. The ransom required to free him from Austrian captivity had cost England an enormous sum raised through taxation that the population had paid, with the particular resentment reserved for expenses that produced no visible domestic benefit. John began his reign with the military disaster that defined everything that followed. Normandy fell to the French king Philip Augustus in 1204 AD, severing in a single campaign the connection between the English crown and its Norman homeland that had defined aristocratic identity since the conquest. The Norman nobility of England were compelled to make a choice that the previous century of cross-channel life had allowed them to defer indefinitely. They were English now, whether they wished to be or not. Their ancestral lands on the continent gone, and their futures bound entirely to the island they had previously regarded as one component of a larger Franco-Norman world. John's attempts to recover the lost territories through subsequent campaigns in France failed at enormous financial cost. The taxes required to fund military expeditions that produced nothing useful, falling on barons who were simultaneously losing patience with a king whose behaviour in domestic governance had moved from demanding to systematically abusive. He manipulated the feudal system in ways that even the elastic standards of medieval kingship found excessive, seizing heirs as political hostages, demanding arbitrary financial payments that had no legal basis in feudal obligation, deploying the machinery of royal justice as a personal instrument of revenge against individuals who had offended him, and demonstrating a consistent preference for humiliating his barons over the more tedious but more sustainable alternative of working with them. By 1215 AD, The relationship between John and his barons had deteriorated past the point of repair through normal political mechanisms. A group of rebel lords who had captured London confronted him at a meadow called Runnymede on the south bank of the Thames in June of that year, with a document whose specific provisions addressed the accumulated grievances of the baronial class with a precision that suggested months of careful legal drafting rather than the improvised demands of an angry mob. John looked at the assembled force behind the document, assessed his options, and signed. Magna Carta, the Great Charter, was in its immediate practical terms a list of feudal grievances and the specific remedies John was agreeing to provide. It addressed the rights of barons to be taxed only with the consent of a council, the rights of freemen to be judged by their peers under established law rather than by arbitrary royal decree, the independence of the church from royal interference, and the obligation of the king to apply the law consistently as a framework governing everyone, rather than as a personal weapon deployable against individuals at will. Much of its content was technical and specific, and the degree to which it applied beyond the baronial class for whom it was primarily written required considerable interpretive stretching before it could be read as a general statement about human rights. But embedded in its clauses was a principle whose significance went further than its authors may have fully intended in the moment of drafting it. The principle that the king was subject to the law, bound by it like everyone else, not its arbitrary source in some personal and unchallengeable sense. John repudiated the charter almost immediately and died the following year in the middle of a renewed civil war, leaving his 9-year-old son Henry to inherit both the throne and the problem. Magna Carta was reissued, revised, and reconfirmed by Henry's regents and subsequently by Henry himself as he grew into his reign, gradually acquiring through repetition and reaffirmation the authority of an established constitutional settlement rather than a document extracted under duress from a king who never intended to honour it. The 13th century that followed was a period of institutional growth conducted in a climate of continued tension between royal authority and baronial expectation. Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, led a baronial rebellion against Henry III that culminated in 1265 AD in a gathering that included not merely nobles and clergy, but elected representatives from the towns and counties of England. A moment that historians have identified as the earliest recognisable ancestor of the English Parliament, even though de Montfort himself was killed in battle later that same year and the immediate political crisis was resolved against him. Edward I, who followed Henry III, was harder and more systematic than his father in almost every dimension of governance. He conquered Wales, imposing English administrative structures on a region that had maintained its political independence since the Anglo-Saxon period, built a network of massive stone castles across the Welsh landscape to anchor his control, and expelled the entire Jewish population of England in 1290 AD in an act of brutal administrative convenience motivated by a combination of financial calculation, religious prejudice, and the political benefit of satisfying popular anti-Jewish sentiment at minimal cost to himself. Then, in the summer of 1348 AD, a ship put into the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, carrying a disease that had been moving westward across Europe for several years, with a mortality that no previous epidemic in human experience provided an adequate framework for understanding. The Black Death killed somewhere between a third and a half of the entire English population across 1348 and 1349, a loss so catastrophic that its economic consequences reshaped the social order in ways that no legislation could prevent. The labour scarcity that resulted from losing half the workforce destroyed the economic logic of serfdom almost overnight. Lords who had previously commanded workers at fixed customary rates found that surviving labourers understood their own scarcity and demanded wages accordingly. Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351 AD, attempting to fix wages at pre-plague levels, and the statute was resented, widely evaded, and ultimately futile against an economic reality more powerful than any legal mechanism designed to suppress it. The accumulated pressure of these economic changes combined with the continued imposition of poll taxes to fund the ongoing 100 Years' War with France, ignited in 1381 AD into the Peasants' Revolt, tens of thousands of people from Essex and Kent marching on London under Wat Tyler, burning the palace of John of Gaunt, opening the prisons, and forcing the 14-year-old King Richard II to ride out and negotiate with an army of commoners who had decided that the old order had taken enough from them and intended to take no more. Henry V had briefly made everything seem possible. His victory at Agincourt in October of 1415 AD, an English force depleted by illness and outnumbered on unfamiliar ground, destroying a much larger French army in a single afternoon through a combination of tactical positioning, longbow firepower, and the particular kind of disciplined collective courage that difficult circumstances sometimes produce, entered the English historical imagination as the defining image of military grace under impossible pressure, the moment when everything the medieval warrior ideal promised about what good leadership and determined men could achieve appeared to be literally, gloriously true. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 AD would have made Henry heir to the French throne itself. A prospect so extraordinary that even the most ambitious English strategic thinking of the previous century had barely dared to articulate it openly. Then, Henry died of dysentery in France in 1422 AD at the age of 35, leaving behind an heir 9 months old and a military position in France that required the kind of sustained, confident, personally commanding royal leadership that a 9-month-old king was not in a position to provide. The 100 Years' War ground on for another 30 years without him, and by 1453 AD, England had lost virtually everything it had spent over a century fighting to hold. Normandy gone in 1450. Gascony and Bordeaux gone 3 years later. The dream of an English crown on the French throne reduced to a formal claim that English kings would continue to assert for centuries without any realistic prospect of making it good. What returned to England from France was a political class humiliated by the scale of the loss. A large number of soldiers with no war left to fight and no obvious civilian role absorbing their energies, and a king entirely unsuited to managing either the anger or the consequences. Henry VI was a genuinely good man in a position that required someone considerably more ruthless. He was mild, pious, intellectually engaged with education and religious devotion in ways that produced lasting contributions. Eton College and King's College, Cambridge both bear his founding imprint, and entirely unable to assert the kind of dominant personal authority that kept medieval nobles competing through legitimate channels rather than through the more direct alternative of taking what they wanted by force. In 1453 AD, the same year that the last English territory in France fell, Henry suffered the first of several episodes of complete mental collapse, falling into a catatonic condition from which he did not emerge for over a year, during which he was apparently conscious of nothing around him and capable of nothing resembling governance. The political vacuum this created activated factional tensions that had been building for years around the figure of Richard, Duke of York, whose military experience in France gave him both the capability and the motivation to insert himself into the space the king's incapacity had opened. The first military engagement at St. Albans in 1455 AD established that the conflict between Yorkist and Lancastrian factions was no longer going to be resolved through court politics alone. The names history attached to the two sides, Lancaster and York, the Red Rose and the White Rose, are somewhat misleading in their symmetrical tidiness. The emblem of the Red Rose was not widely used as a Lancastrian symbol during the conflict itself, gaining prominence largely in retrospect under the Tudor dynasty that followed, and had strong political reasons for emphasizing the neatness of the resolution their own rise represented. The actual war was fought between shifting factional coalitions whose composition changed repeatedly as individual lords calculated where their interests lay and adjusted their allegiances accordingly. The roses providing a retrospective clarity that the participants themselves did not experience. The Battle of Towton, fought in a snowstorm in Yorkshire on the 29th of March, 1461 AD, gives the clearest measure of what the conflict actually cost. The two armies met on an open field in bitter winter conditions, with the wind driving directly into the Lancastrian lines, giving the Yorkist longbowmen a range advantage that compounded into catastrophe as Lancastrian arrows fell short and Yorkist forces advanced into the gap. The defeated army was pursued and killed as it fled across the frozen ground. The estimates of the dead ranging between 9,000 and 28,000 men, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil by any reasonable accounting. The snow running red across the field in descriptions that contemporary chroniclers set down with the quiet precision of people who had actually seen what they were writing about. Edward IV stabilised England after the worst of the fighting, reigning with the confident authority of a man who had won his throne in battle and understood that keeping it required both military credibility and enough political intelligence to manage the barons whose support had made the victory possible. His secret marriage in 1464 AD to Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of modest standing by royal standards, proved the central political miscalculation of his reign, not because the marriage itself was disastrous, but because the elevation of the large Woodville family that followed displaced existing nobles from positions they had expected to occupy, alienating above all Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the man whose military and political genius had done more than any other single figure to put Edward on the throne. Warwick's response was the most dramatic act of political reinvention in a period full of dramatic reinventions. He switched sides, allied with the Lancastrian cause, briefly restored Henry VI to the throne, and was killed at the Battle of Barnet in 1471 AD in a confused engagement where morning fog contributed to a catastrophic friendly fire incident that turned the tide before the outcome could be decided on. Straightforward military terms. Richard III, who seized the throne in 1483 AD, after intercepting his nephew Edward V and installing him in the Tower alongside his younger brother, where both boys subsequently disappeared, reigned for 2 years and 2 months before Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven in August of 1485 AD, with approximately 2,000 men and the backing of the French crown. The Battle of Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August, 1485, decided everything in roughly 2 hours, turning on the moment when Richard spotted Henry Tudor positioned away from the main fighting and led a cavalry charge directly at him. Bold, decisive, and entirely consistent with the medieval tradition of resolving battles through personal combat between leaders, only to find William Stanley's forces closing around him as the Stanleys finally committed to Henry's side. Richard was killed, the last English king to die in battle, the last Plantagenet, buried without ceremony in Leicester and forgotten for 500 years until archaeologists found his skeleton beneath a car park in 2012 AD. Henry Tudor married Elizabeth of York in January of 1486 AD, uniting the two houses whose conflict had consumed England for 30 years, and the island that had been accumulating its extraordinary layered identity across 15 centuries. Roman roads beneath Anglo-Saxon villages, beneath Norman castles, beneath Plantagenet law courts, moved forward into a new age, carrying all of it, every conquered and unconquered piece, into whatever came next.